There is a certain kind of civilization that history tends to overlook, not because it was unimportant, but because it never fit the mold we use to measure importance. No conquests, no emperors, no colossal monuments rising from the desert floor. The Sogdians built none of these things. What they built was invisible to the eye and nearly indestructible, in practice, a web of trust, language, and commercial intelligence that stretched from the gates of China to the walls of Constantinople. For over 1,000 years, they were the people who kept the ancient world's economy breathing. They ran the Silk Road, the most complex, dangerous, and consequential trade network in pre-modern history, not with armies, but with letters, family connections, spoken agreements, and an almost uncanny gift for being exactly where commerce needed someone to be. And almost nobody today knows their name. That oversight is one of history's more spectacular failures of attention. Because the Sogdians did not merely participate in the ancient world, in many of the ways that matter most, they invented it. The land they called home sits deep in the heart of Central Asia, in territory that most modern people could not locate on a map without assistance. Sogdiana was not a country in any modern sense. It had no fixed borders enforced by armies, no capital in the way that Rome or Chang'an was a capital. It was instead a cluster of oasis city-states occupying the fertile river valleys between two of the great rivers of the ancient world, the Amu Darya, the Oxus of the Greeks, and the Seir Darya, the ancient Jaxartes, both sweeping northwest from the Pamirs and the Tian Shan Mountains toward the Aral Sea. Between these rivers, surrounded on nearly every side by desert, steppe, and mountain, the Sogdians built something that defied its own geography. The centerpiece of their world was the Zarafshan River Valley. The name is telling in itself. It means scattering gold in the local language, not a reference to precious metal deposits hidden in the earth, but to the extraordinary blaze of the autumn poplars that line the riverbanks every year, turning the whole valley into a corridor of burning gold. This was no metaphor for scarcity. The Zarafshan Valley supported dense orchards, vineyards, grain fields, and groves of mulberry trees whose leaves fed the silkworms that produced one of the ancient world's most coveted commodities. It sustained cities of tens of thousands of people. Samarkand and Bukhara were not outposts on the ragged edge of civilization. They were genuine urban centers, sophisticated, ambitious, self-aware, surrounded by agricultural hinterlands of impressive productivity and linked to the rest of the world by routes that the Sogdians knew better than anyone alive. The Sogdians belonged to the eastern branch of the Iranian language family, close linguistic cousins to the speakers of Old Persian, sharing with them the broad cultural inheritance of the Iranian world, Zoroastrianism, epic poetry, the specific aesthetic and social traditions refined across centuries of Iranian civilization. But their position on the far eastern edge of that world gave them something that the Western Iranians never possessed: a simultaneous immersion in the steppe nomadic cultures to the north, the Buddhist civilizations spreading from the south, and the vast Chinese world beyond the mountains. They were, culturally speaking, a people of the in-between, and they turned that position into their most decisive competitive advantage. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Zarafshan Valley shows Bronze Age settlement patterns with substantial craft production and long-distance trade connections predating any written record by centuries. The commercial orientation of Sogdian civilization was not a sudden historical invention. It was the slow continuation of something very old, a productive culture that had been exchanging goods with distant partners long before anyone wrote their name down. That matters, because it means the Sogdians did not stumble into commercial greatness. They grew into it deliberately, generation by generation, refining the tools of exchange, the way other civilizations refined the tools of war. What the oasis landscape demanded, the Sogdians learned to supply. Survival in islands of extraordinary fertility, surrounded by desert, required two things in equal measure: the intensive development of every productive resource available within the oasis itself, and the active, intelligent management of connections with the world beyond its boundaries. These were never separate projects. They were the same project expressed simultaneously in two directions. The agriculture that fed Samarkand required hydraulic engineering of a sophistication that was genuinely remarkable by the standards of the ancient world. Canal networks, distribution, weirs, check dams, and the complex social institutions that organized and sustained them across generations, these were as fundamental to Sogdian civilization as any market or caravan route. The main canal systems of the Zerevshan Valley, some of which remain in operation today after roughly 2,000 years of continuous use, stand as quiet monuments to a collective investment in the future that most ancient civilizations never achieved. A single major canal could supply water to hundreds of kilometers of farmland. Maintaining it required the coordinated labor and the sustained agreement of thousands of farmers whose livelihoods depended on it. The social institutions that governed water allocation, organized communal labor, and enforced maintenance obligations were not glamorous. They left no inscriptions in stone, but their survival across successive waves of conquest and political upheaval speaks to how deeply the Sogdian communities had invested in this infrastructure, not merely as an economic asset, but as the foundation of collective life itself. The steppe nomads who inhabited the vast grasslands surrounding the Sogdian oases were simultaneously their most dangerous neighbors and their most indispensable commercial partners. The nomads needed what the oasis produced: grain, textiles, metalwork, luxury goods. The Sogdians needed what the nomads controlled: horses, protection from predatory raids, and crucially, safe passage through the steppe routes that connected oasis to oasis across the continental interior. Managing this relationship, cultivating genuine working arrangements with successive waves of nomadic power while minimizing the predatory dimension of that power, was one of the most consistently demanding challenges of Sogdian political life. They met it, generation after generation, with the same pragmatic intelligence they applied to everything else. The urban landscape that the Sogdians built within these constraints was more impressive than its surviving remains might initially suggest. Samarkand, known in ancient sources as Marakanda, was already a substantial and prosperous city when Alexander the Great's army captured it in the year 329 before the Common Era. The Greek historian Arrian, drawing on eyewitness accounts of Alexander's campaign, noted that the city was large and prosperous, understated praise. Given that Arrian was writing for readers familiar with the great cities of the Hellenistic world, the palaces of the Sogdian aristocracy, of which the ancient site at Panji, Kent, provides the best preserved surviving example, were decorated with wall paintings of astonishing quality and iconographic richness. The Panji frescoes, excavated by Soviet and Tajik archaeologists from the 1940s onward, and now displayed in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg and the Tajik National Museum in Dushanbe, show a world of feasting nobles, epic battles, mythological scenes, and a specific visual vocabulary of aristocratic culture unlike anything produced elsewhere in the ancient world. Musicians play at long tables. Warriors charge across walls with a dynamism that still communicates speed and violence across 15 centuries. Goddesses preside over ceremonies whose exact meanings are still debated by scholars. What these paintings make unmistakably clear is that the Sogdians were not merely practical people who happened to be good at trading. They were a civilization with a rich inner life, an aesthetic ambition, and a sense of their own identity vigorous enough to cover the walls of their palaces with the stories they found most worth telling. The social organization that animated all of this was distinctive in the ancient world for one particular reason: the relatively high status it accorded to merchants. In most ancient civilizations, the commercial class occupied a position below the warrior aristocracy and the priestly establishment. Tolerated as economically necessary, but rarely celebrated as socially admirable. In Sogdiana, the calculus was reversed. Commercial success was the primary source of both individual wealth and collective prosperity. And the merchants who organized and executed the long-distance trade on which the civilization depended occupied a social position that gave them genuine prestige alongside their material wealth. This was not sentimentality. It was a rational adaptation to economic reality. A society whose survival depended on the caravan and the merchant letter had every reason to honor the people who made those things possible. That the Sogdians made this adaptation so thoroughly, and so early, is perhaps the single most important thing to understand about them. If you wanted to find the most religiously diverse square mile in the ancient world, you might reasonably start your search in Samarkand. On any given morning, in the 6th or 7th century of the Common Era, a visitor walking through the city's streets could pass a Zoroastrian fire temple where priests tended the sacred flame with ritual precision, a Buddhist monastery where monks debated the nature of consciousness, a Manichaean assembly house where the followers of the prophet Mani sang hymns that wove together 3 different religious traditions into one luminous theology, and an Nestorian Christian chapel where a congregation condemned as heretical by the Byzantine Church prayed in Syriac to the same God their persecutors worshipped. None of these communities were in hiding. None were merely tolerated in the way that a powerful majority tolerates a nuisance minority. They coexisted, traded with each other, hired each other's members, and occasionally worshipped at each other's shrines. This was not a philosophical achievement. The Sogdians were not proto-liberals who had arrived at a theory of religious pluralism centuries before the Enlightenment. Their tolerance was something more durable and more honest than ideology. It was a commercial necessity. A people whose prosperity depended on maintaining working relationships with partners from dozens of different cultural and religious backgrounds simply could not afford to make faith a barrier to business. The result, whatever its origins, was one of the most genuinely open religious environments in the pre-modern world. The foundation beneath all of this openness was Zoroastrianism, the ancient Iranian religion centered on the worship of Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of truth and light, maintained through the sacred fire and the ritual practices of the Avestan tradition. The fire temples of the Sogdian cities were not merely religious installations, they were the centers of community identity, the places where the deepest shared values of Sogdian civilization were expressed and renewed. The Zoroastrian moral framework shaped commercial life in ways that went far beyond the merely abstract. The religion's horror of deception, its insistence that honest dealing in commerce was a form of devotion to Ahura Mazda himself. A small daily act in the eternal cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood gave Sogdian merchants a reputation for reliability that was itself commercially valuable. In a world where contracts were difficult to enforce across long distances, where there were no courts capable of adjudicating disputes between a merchant in Samarkand and a partner in Chang'an, the reputation for honest dealing was not merely a moral virtue. It was a competitive advantage of the First Order. Buddhism arrived in Sogdiana from the south, carried along the same commercial routes that brought Indian goods northward into the Central Asian oases. Sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era, the Sogdian response to it was characteristically pragmatic. They did not convert wholesale. Abandoning Zoroastrianism for the new tradition, they adopted what they found useful: the cosmopolitan ethics, the sophisticated philosophical tradition, the ritual repertoire, while maintaining their Zoroastrian identity as the cultural bedrock beneath everything else. The numerous Buddhist monasteries and stupas that appeared in Sogdian cities, alongside the fire temples, were not signs of a civilization confused about its own identity. They were signs of a civilization confident enough in itself to absorb new ideas without being threatened by them. Manichaeism, the extraordinary syncretic religion founded by the Babylonian prophet Mani in the 3rd century of the Common Era, combining Zoroastrian dualism, Buddhist ethics, and Christian salvation theology into a single luminous framework found in the Sogdian merchant class, some of its most effective missionaries. The Manichaean texts translated into Sogdian represent among the earliest translations of that tradition into any language, making Sogdian one of the primary literary vehicles through which Mani's ideas travelled east. That Sogdian merchants carried Manichaean scriptures in their luggage, alongside bolts of silk and blocks of musk. When you think about it, a perfectly Sogdian thing to do, moving ideas and commodities simultaneously, treating both as worthy of the journey. Nestorian Christianity, the tradition associated with the patriarch Nestorius, condemned at the Council of Ephesus in the year 431, but widely practiced across the Persian Empire and along the eastern trade routes, also established communities in the Sogdian oases. The Nestorian Christians of Samarkand were not a large community, but their presence there is telling. The votive deposits found in Sogdian archaeological contexts confirm what the texts suggest. Zoroastrian ossuaries sit alongside Buddhist images. Christian crosses appear near fire temple installations, and Manichaean manuscripts surface in the same archives as Zoroastrian ritual texts. The material record of Sogdian religious life is a patchwork that defies simple categorization and rewards patient attention. The feast was the central institution of Sogdian aristocratic life, the occasion at which relationships were renewed, alliances confirmed, status performed, and the collective identity of the elite expressed through shared pleasure. The feast scenes in the Panjikent frescoes return to this subject again and again with a consistency that speaks to its cultural centrality. Nobles recline on cushioned divans, attended by servants bearing wine and food. Musicians play the barbat, the plucked string instrument that was the ancestor of the European lute, alongside the transverse flute, the frame drum, and the harp. Dancers move with a dynamism that the painters captured in confident, observation-derived lines, their bodies caught in mid-motion with a naturalism that puts you directly in the room. What makes these images more than merely decorative is the specificity of the detail. These were not generic images of pleasure. They were records of particular cultural practices, particular instrument combinations, particular performance styles that the Sogdians had refined over generations and considered important enough to preserve on the walls of their most significant buildings. That instinct proved historically consequential. The Tang dynasty of China, which ruled from 618 to 907 of the Common Era, and is generally regarded as one of the high points of Chinese civilization, developed an extraordinary enthusiasm for Sogdian entertainment that is documented extensively in Chinese, textual and material sources. Tang imperial courts employed Sogdian musicians, dancers, and acrobats whose exotic appeal was a mark of cosmopolitan sophistication among the Chinese elite. The dance form, known in Chinese sources as the Sogdian whirl, a spectacular spinning performance executed by male dancers that seemed to contemporaries to defy the ordinary physics of the human body, became genuinely fashionable in Tang China, appearing in paintings, poems, and the vivid three-dimensional ceramic figurines that survive in museums today. The poet Li Bai wrote about it with evident fascination, drawn to the spectacle of a body in controlled, extraordinary motion. The barbat that Sogdian musicians brought to the Tang court became the pipa. One of the most important instruments in the Chinese musical tradition, its fingering techniques, tuning systems, and performance conventions shaped by the Sogdian transmission and still audible in traditional Chinese music centuries later. The silk textiles that Sogdian weavers produced were among the most technically sophisticated and most widely distributed luxury goods in the ancient world. The characteristic Sogdian design, the pearl roundel pattern, a circle of beads enclosing confronted animals at the center, often lions, birds, or horses facing each other, in heraldic symmetry became one of the most widely imitated artistic motifs of the medieval world. Fragments of Sogdian silk have been recovered from churches in France and Germany, from burial mounds in Scandinavia, from tombs across China and Japan, the physical residue of a commercial network that truly spanned the known world. These textile fragments are among the most poignant objects in the history of commerce, small pieces of cloth that traveled farther in their lifetimes than most human beings who have ever lived. The drawloom technology that produced them, allowing large-scale patterned fabrics in multiple colors to be woven with repeating precision, was among the most complex industrial technology of the ancient world. And the Sogdian weavers who mastered it were not artisans operating at the margins of their civilization. They were central to it, producing goods whose value depended on a combination of technical mastery and aesthetic intelligence that no casual competitor could replicate. The wine culture of Sogdiana deserves mention alongside the silk, because it traveled nearly as far and left nearly as lasting an impression. The Zerevshan Valley's viticulture tradition, its specific grape varieties, cultivation techniques, and winemaking practices refined over centuries was transmitted eastward into China through Sogdian commercial channels. And the Tang fashion for Central Asian wine was partly a fashion for specifically Sogdian cultural practice. The Chinese word for grape, putao, is itself a linguistic fossil of this transmission, borrowed from a Central Asian language during the period of commercial contact and preserved in the Chinese vocabulary ever since. A small word carrying the memory of an ancient exchange. There is a thought experiment worth sitting with for a moment. Imagine you are a merchant in 7th century Samarkand. You want to move a consignment of silk from Chang'an in China to Constantinople in the Byzantine Empire, a distance of roughly 7,000 kilometers across some of the most punishing terrain on Earth. You will cross the Taklamakan Desert, where entire caravans have vanished without trace. You will negotiate passage through the territories of steppe nomadic confederations whose political loyalties shift with the season. You will pass through a dozen different political jurisdictions, each with its own taxation regime, its own local officials capable of demanding bribes, its own risks of banditry, warfare, and natural disaster. You will need credit to finance the journey before you have sold a single bolt of cloth. You will need accommodation, food, and animal fodder at regular intervals. You will need current intelligence about market conditions at the destination because silk prices in Constantinople depend on factors happening thousands of kilometers away. And arriving with the wrong goods at the wrong moment is the difference between profit and ruin. Now imagine doing all of this without a telephone, without a bank, without a legal system capable of enforcing contracts across international borders, and without a government powerful enough to guarantee your safety anywhere beyond your home city's walls. The question is not how anyone managed this. The question is how the Sogdians managed it so consistently, so profitably, and for so long. The answer is the network, and understanding the network is understanding everything about the Sogdians that matters most. The Sogdian commercial network was not a company, not a guild, and not a government institution. It was something more organic and more resilient than any of those things, an interlocking system of family connections, shared cultural identity, mutual commercial obligation, and distributed intelligence that gave Sogdian merchants a collective advantage over any competitor operating outside its boundaries. The physical infrastructure of this network was the Sogdian diaspora, the constellation of merchant communities established in cities across the full length of the Silk Road. From Merv in the west to Dunhuang and Chang'an in the east, these diaspora communities were not merely clusters of homesick expatriates. They were operational nodes in a living commercial system. A Sogdian merchant arriving in a new city could expect to find a community of fellow Sogdians who spoke his language, shared his cultural and religious background, possessed current knowledge of local market conditions, maintained relationships with local authorities, and were prepared to extend him credit, accommodation, and commercial intelligence on the basis of shared identity and the reciprocal obligations that identity carried. This was not charity. It was rational collective behavior from people who understood that the network's value to each individual member depended on every member maintaining their obligations to every other. The trust infrastructure that made this system function was the Sogdians' most impressive and least visible achievement. In an era before formal banking, before internationally enforceable contract law, before the telegraph or the postal service in any reliable sense, the Sogdians built a credit system that could extend financing across 7,000 kilometers on the basis of reputation, family connection, and the social consequences of default within a tight-knit commercial community. Defaulting on a debt to a Sogdian partner was not merely a financial failure. It was a social catastrophe that could end a merchant's career permanently. Because the network through which all future business would need to flow was the same network whose members would hear about the default within months. That combination of incentive and consequence, maintained not by courts or enforcement agencies, but by the community itself, was more effective than most formal legal systems at ensuring commercial reliability across vast distances. The most intimate surviving window into this network in operation is a cache of documents found in a watchtower at Dunhuang in northwestern China, dated to approximately 313 to 314 of the Common Era, the oldest surviving merchant correspondence in the world. These letters, written on paper in the Sogdian script and apparently abandoned when the watchtower's mail relay system collapsed during a period of political turmoil, were sent by Sogdian merchants in China back to their home communities in Samarkand. Their content is startling in its immediacy. Commercial reports on market conditions and commodity prices sit alongside requests for specific merchandise, complaints about debtors who have failed to pay, personal news, and family concerns expressed with an emotional directness that cuts across 17 centuries without losing any of its force. One letter in particular, the text scholars call the first Old Sogdian letter, is written in the voice of a woman named Nanai Dat, reporting on behalf of the merchant Nanai Vand. She describes the disruption of commercial routes, the destruction of cities, the deaths of merchants, and the general chaos following the collapse of the Western Jin dynasty in China with a vividness that no formal historical chronicle matches. Her line describing the conditions she faced, that she would rather be a dog or a pig than endure what a woman in China was then enduring, has been quoted by every historian who has encountered this document, because its rawness communicates human experience across 2 millennia with an immediacy that polished literary sources rarely achieve. These were not letters written for posterity. They were working documents, written by real people managing real commercial relationships under real pressure. And their survival is one of the more extraordinary accidents in the history of human record-keeping. The goods that flowed through the network were as diverse as its geographic reach. Silk, the luxury textile that gave the Silk Road its name, was the most famous commodity, but by no means the only significant one. Horses were among the most commercially critical goods moving through the Sogdian system, with the Tang dynasty paying extraordinary prices for the large steppe and mountain breeds that their cavalry required. The heavenly horses of the Fergana Valley, in what is now Uzbekistan, animals of unusual size, stamina, and a distinctive gait that made them exceptional military mounts, came from a region that was culturally and commercially Sogdian, and the network through which they reached Chinese buyers was staffed almost entirely by Sogdian merchants, who understood both the breeding conditions that produced the best animals and the military procurement systems that purchased them. Glass produced in Syrian and Levantine workshops moved eastward as a luxury good of enormous value in Central Asia and China, where glass-making technology had not been fully mastered. Spices, incense, medicinal substances, dyes, gemstones, and aromatic resins moved in both directions. Musk, from the musk deer of the Tibetan Plateau and the Central Asian mountains, one of the highest value commodities by weight in the ancient world, moved westward through Sogdian hands to the perfumers of Persia and the Mediterranean, and underneath all of these physical commodities flowed something even more valuable information: commercial intelligence about market conditions, political developments, the movements of armies and caravans, the reliability of specific trading partners, and the safety of specific routes was gathered, verified, and distributed through the network as deliberately as any bolt of silk or bag of musk. A Sogdian merchant who knew that a drought in a particular region was reducing grain supplies, or that a new ruler was imposing unexpected commercial regulations, or that a rival caravan had been robbed on a specific mountain pass, possessed information that translated directly into competitive advantage. The cultivation and distribution of this intelligence was a form of collective commercial knowledge production that no individual merchant operating outside the network could replicate or purchase at any price. The caravanserai, the inn and commercial facility designed to serve the caravans that were the primary vehicle of overland Silk Road trade, was one of the Sogdian network's most important practical innovations. These were not merely places to sleep. They provided storage facilities with standardized weights and measures, money-changing services, the company of other merchants who carried fresh market intelligence, and relationships with local authorities who could mediate disputes or facilitate the payment of transit fees. The Sogdian caravanserai tradition, eventually adopted and elaborated across the Islamic world, was the physical embodiment of the network's logic, a standardized infrastructure of trust and practical support that reduced the cost and risk of long-distance commerce for everyone who participated in it. In the spring of 329 before the Common Era, Alexander the Great rode into Marakanda, the city the world would later call Samarkand, and found, to all appearances, exactly what he expected: a prosperous oasis city whose gates had opened before the unstoppable momentum of his eastward campaign. He had already destroyed the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the largest political structure the world had ever seen. He had crossed deserts and mountains that his advisors had called impassable. The capture of a Central Asian commercial city, however wealthy, must have seemed like a formality. What followed was anything but. Sogdiana would consume 3 years of Alexander's campaign, longer than the conquest of the entire Persian heartland, and it would do so not through pitched battles or fortified walls, but through something that has frustrated conventional military power in every era of human history: a population that refused to accept that it had been conquered. Led by a man of extraordinary tactical intelligence who understood that the steppe was a weapon as lethal as any cavalry charge. His name was Spitamenes, and he is among the most underappreciated military figures of the ancient world. A Sogdian nobleman who had briefly cooperated with Alexander before concluding that cooperation was simply another word for subjugation. Spitamenes organized a guerrilla campaign that exploited everything Alexander's army could not effectively counter. The Macedonian forces were formidable in open battle, disciplined and experienced in the set-piece engagements that had shattered the Persian military. But Spitamenes had no intention of offering them a set-piece engagement. He struck at isolated detachments and extended supply lines, then dissolved back into the steppe before concentrated Macedonian forces could bring him to battle. He cultivated relationships with the nomadic Saka and Massagete cavalry of the surrounding steppe, giving his forces a mobility that Alexander's infantry-heavy army could not match across the vast open distances of Central Asia. He used the local population's knowledge of terrain, water sources, and hidden routes in ways that an invading army operating thousands of kilometers from its bases could never replicate. The military problem he posed was the classic challenge of guerrilla warfare against a superior conventional force. And he posed it with a sophistication that left Alexander, who had never before been denied a decisive military resolution, genuinely frustrated for the better part of 3 years. Alexander's eventual response combined systematic devastation of areas supporting the resistance, with the construction of fortified garrison points at strategic locations and the intensive recruitment of local allies, whose terrain knowledge could match the rebels' own. It was effective, ultimately, but it cost time, lives, and the kind of psychological energy that comes from fighting an enemy who will not stand still long enough to be defeated. Spitamenes was eventually killed, betrayed, according to some sources, by his own Massagete allies, who had concluded that his continued resistance was more dangerous to them than accommodation with the Macedonians. His death ended the organized military resistance. But the political solution that actually consolidated Macedonian control over Sogdiana was not military at all. It was a marriage. Alexander's wedding to Roxana, the daughter of a Sogdian nobleman named Oxyates, who had held out against the Macedonians in an apparently impregnable mountain fortress, was a calculated political act of the first order. It converted a prominent enemy into a prominent supporter and sent an unmistakable signal to the Sogdian aristocracy. Cooperation with the new ruler would bring status and influence, not merely subjugation and loss. The pragmatic Sogdian elite, who had always understood that the management of powerful outsiders was a permanent condition of life in their geographic position, received that signal and acted on it with the same practical intelligence they applied to commercial negotiations. The cultural impact of the Macedonian conquest proved more lasting than the political one. Greek influence entered Sogdiana through the Macedonian and subsequent Seleucid periods, and left traces that persisted for centuries in art, commercial practice, and the broader cultural vocabulary of the Sogdian elite. The specific form of the Sogdian city-state, the local lord in his decorated palace, surrounded by armed retainers, managing both the agricultural hinterland and the commercial traffic flowing through his territory, incorporated elements of the Hellenistic court model alongside older Iranian and steppe traditions. The remarkable wall paintings of the Sogdian palaces are the visual expression of this synthesis Hellenistic figure types, rendered with Iranian mythological content and steppe animal-style decorative elements, all combined in a visual language that belongs to no single tradition and is instantly recognizable as Sogdian. This capacity for cultural synthesis, the ability to absorb influences from multiple directions without losing coherence, was not a passive quality. It was an active, deliberate achievement that reflected the same intelligence the Sogdians applied to commerce. The Seleucid successors of Alexander, the Greco-Bactrian kingdom that followed them, the Parthian Empire, and the Kushan Empire that dominated Central Asia in the early centuries of the Common Era, each in turn became the dominant political power in the region surrounding the Sogdian oases, and in each case, the Sogdian response followed the same fundamental logic: maintain workable relationships with whoever held power. cultivate hedging relationships with alternative powers that might become relevant if the primary patron weakened, and preserve the conditions for commercial activity as the non-negotiable priority that all other political calculations served. This was not cowardice or opportunism in any simple sense. It was the rational strategy of a people who had correctly identified their own civilization's foundations and organized their political behavior accordingly. An oasis city-state with no significant standing army could not afford ideological rigidity in its foreign policy. What it could afford, what it absolutely required, was the commercial continuity that only stable relationships with surrounding powers could guarantee. The Sogdians pursued that continuity, with a consistency across centuries that amounts to one of the more impressive, sustained strategic achievements in the history of statecraft. The relationship between the Sogdian city-states and the Western Turkic Khaganate, the nomadic empire that dominated the Central Asian steppe across the 6th and 7th centuries of the Common Era, represented the fullest and most consequential expression of the Sogdian diplomatic model. It was also, arguably, the period of the Silk Road's greatest commercial vitality. And the two facts were directly connected. The Western Turkic Khagans needed what the Sogdians could provide: access to the luxury goods of the settled world. The commercial revenues generated by taxing the Silk Road traffic that moved through their territories, and the administrative and diplomatic expertise needed to manage relationships with the great sedentary empires at both ends of the route. The Sogdians needed what the Khagans could provide: military protection of the steppe routes along which their caravans moved, political relationships with the nomadic powers that controlled the critical passages between oases, and the legitimacy that association with a powerful patron gave to Sogdian commercial operations throughout the Khaganate's vast territory. The specific mechanisms through which this partnership operated were sophisticated and deliberately designed. Sogdian commercial advisors served at the Turkic court, providing market intelligence and diplomatic expertise to Khagans, whose military power was formidable, but whose knowledge of the settled commercial world was limited. Sogdian merchants managed significant portions of the Turkic imperial economy, handling the commercial translation of steppe wealth in horses, furs, and pastoral products into the luxury goods that the Turkic elite desired. Sogdian scribes and translators managed the Khaganate's diplomatic correspondence with external powers, giving Sogdian cultural influence a reach that extended far beyond the oasis cities themselves into the political councils of the steppe empire. The result was a functional partnership that sustained the Silk Road's commercial operations at a scale and geographic reach that neither partner could have achieved independently. The caravans that moved silk westward and horses eastward during the 6th and 7th centuries were not merely commercial ventures. They were the arteries of a civilizational system in which the Sogdians occupied the indispensable central position, managing the flows that kept the entire structure alive. That position of indispensability, built not through conquest or inheritance, but through the patient accumulation of expertise, relationships, and trust, was the Sogdian achievement at its most complete. The epitaphs of Sogdian merchants buried in China during the 6th through 8th centuries of the Common Era are among the most humanly affecting documents in the history of the Silk Road. These stone inscriptions, discovered in Chinese tombs scattered across the territories of the Tang Empire, record lives that followed a pattern so consistent it amounts to a template for the Sogdian experience in China. A young man leaves Samarkand or Bukhara or Kish, typically in his teens or early 20s, traveling east with a caravan organized by family members or community partners. He establishes himself in a Chinese commercial center, Chang'an, Luoyang, or one of the frontier trading posts, building relationships with local merchants, Chinese officials, and the wider community of Sogdian expatriates whose network gives him his initial foothold. Over years and decades, he constructs a successful business, marries into a Chinese family, raises children who grow up speaking Chinese as their primary language, and gradually accumulates the social and commercial connections of a man fully embedded in Chinese life. Hades in China. Surrounded by descendants who carry Sogdian family names but live in all essential respects as Chinese. His epitaph, composed in Chinese literary style by someone who knew the conventions of Chinese funerary commemoration, records his Sogdian origin, his commercial achievements, and his Chinese social connections in a single document that is itself a material artifact of cultural synthesis, a stone inscription standing at the intersection of two worlds, marking the life of a man who spent his entire career navigating between them. These epitaphs do not record heroes or emperors. They record ordinary people living extraordinary lives. And their cumulative testimony establishes beyond any reasonable doubt how deeply the Sogdian commercial presence had penetrated the social and economic fabric of Tang China. The Sogdian community in Tang China was not a marginal or exotic presence. It was a structural component of the Tang commercial system, providing the human infrastructure through which the westward flow of Chinese goods and the eastward flow of Central Asian commodities was organized and managed. The Sogdian translators who facilitated the transmission of Buddhist texts from Sanskrit into Chinese contributed to one of the great intellectual projects of the medieval world, the translation of the Buddhist canon, involving hundreds of individuals working across several centuries. Required people fluent in both Sanskrit and Chinese, who also possessed deep knowledge of Buddhist theology. The Sogdians, with their characteristic linguistic facility and their long familiarity with the Buddhist traditions of Central Asia, provided a significant proportion of the translators and intermediaries who made this transmission possible. The acrobats who performed at Tang imperial court entertainments, captured in vivid ceramic figurines that survive in museum collections today. The musicians whose instrument combinations reshaped the Tang court entertainment tradition. The merchants whose commercial networks supplied the luxury goods that made Tang aristocratic life as materially splendid as it was. All of these were dimensions of a Sogdian presence in China that was simultaneously commercial, cultural, and deeply personal. The most dramatic individual produced by this world of Sogdian Chinese intersection was not a merchant or a translator or a musician. He was a military commander, and his career ended in catastrophe on a scale that permanently altered the history of China. His name was An Lushan, and he was born on the northeastern frontier of the Tang Empire in the contested zone where Chinese, Turkish, and Sogdian cultural worlds overlapped and interpenetrated. His father was of Sogdian origin, his mother Turkic, and he grew up speaking multiple languages: Chinese, Turkish, and several other frontier tongues with the fluency that came from genuine immersion rather than formal study. That linguistic range was the foundation of his early career. Tang frontier administration depended heavily on individuals who could navigate the cultural and linguistic complexity of the empire's borders. Communicating effectively with the nomadic peoples beyond the frontier, while operating within the Chinese bureaucratic and military systems on the inside. An Lushan's abilities in this regard brought him to the attention of senior Tang officials, with the speed that genuine rare competence tends to produce in any administrative system hungry for it. By the 740s of the Common Era, he was commanding substantial frontier armies and had become one of the most powerful military figures in the empire. Holding simultaneously the governorship of 3 northeastern frontier provinces, a concentration of military authority that, in retrospect, was extraordinarily dangerous, but that the Tang court extended because An Lushan had made himself appear indispensable. The personal relationships he cultivated at the imperial court, including a famously warm connection with the Emperor Xuanzong and an even more famously complex relationship with the emperor's beloved consort, Yang Guifei, gave him access to the political center of the empire that no frontier commander should have possessed. The rebellion that An Lushan launched in the year 755 of the Common Era began with the military forces under his direct command, and within months had grown into the most devastating civil war in Chinese history to that point. His armies swept southward from the northeastern frontier, capturing the imperial capital of Luoyang and forcing Emperor Xuanzong to flee Chang'an in one of the most humiliating episodes in Tang imperial history. The human cost of the conflict that followed the An Lushan Rebellion, as Chinese historiography names, it was staggering. Modern demographic analysis of Tang population records before and after the rebellion suggests that the conflict and its associated famines, displacements, and secondary violence may have killed as many as 30 million people. One of the deadliest episodes of violence in all of pre-modern history. The Tang dynasty survived, but it survived diminished. Its political authority fragmented. Its cosmopolitan confidence shattered. The openness to Central Asian cultural influences that had made Tang China the most internationally engaged civilization of its era contracted sharply in the rebellion's aftermath. The Sogdian cultural presence in China, the musicians, the dancers, the merchants, the acrobats never recovered its pre-rebellion prominence. An Lushan, the man of Sogdian descent who had risen higher in Chinese imperial service than any Central Asian before him, had by his ambition and his rebellion ensured that no Central Asian would be trusted with comparable power again. 4 years before An Lushan's rebellion reshaped China from within. A military engagement on the far western edge of Tang power had already reshaped Central Asia from without. The Battle of Talas, fought in the year 751 of the Common Era near the Talas River, in what is now Kyrgyzstan, pitted a Tang army commanded by the Korean-born general Gao Xianzhi against a combined force of the Arab Abbasid Caliphate and its Turkic and Karluk allies. The Tang forces had been conducting military operations in the Fergana Valley region, the same territory that produced the heavenly horses so coveted by the Chinese cavalry when they encountered the Abbasid allied army. The engagement was initially competitive, but at a critical moment, the Karluk Turkic cavalry that had been fighting alongside the Tang forces switched sides, joining the Abbasid forces and turning the battle's balance decisively and irreversibly against the Chinese. Gao Xianzhi withdrew with what remained of his army, and the Tang military presence in Central Asia effectively ended at that moment, never to be meaningfully re-established. The immediate military consequence was clear enough. Arab dominance over the Central Asian region was confirmed, and the political protection that the Sogdian city-states had hoped the Tang connection might provide against Arab pressure was removed at precisely the moment when they needed it most. But the longer consequence of the battle was something far stranger and more consequential than any territorial adjustment. Among the prisoners captured by the Arab forces at Talas were Chinese soldiers who possessed knowledge of papermaking, the technology developed in China centuries earlier, and guarded with the kind of strategic jealousy that states reserve for their most valuable technical secrets. That knowledge, transmitted to Arab craftsmen in the aftermath of the battle, led directly to the establishment of a papermaking workshop in Samarkand, the first such facility outside China. From Samarkand, the technology spread to Baghdad, to Egypt, to North Africa, and eventually to Europe, where it made possible the printing press, the mass production of books, and the information revolution that transformed the intellectual life of the early modern world. A single military defeat on a Central Asian riverbank in 751 set in motion a chain of technological transmission whose endpoint was Gutenberg, mass literacy, and the modern world's relationship with the written word. History rarely offers neater demonstrations of the butterfly effect than this one. And it is deeply characteristic of the Sogdian story that even the catastrophe that helped end their political independence managed to produce one of the most consequential technological transfers in human history. The Arab conquest of Transoxiana, the territory beyond the Oxus that the Islamic world used to describe Sogdiana and the surrounding region, was not the swift, overwhelming campaign that the Arab conquests of Persia and Syria had been. Those earlier campaigns had faced centralized states whose military defeat meant political collapse. Sogdiana offered something more frustrating and more resilient, a fragmented political landscape of independent city-states, each capable of its own resistance, none whose fall automatically meant the fall of the others. Surrounded by steppe terrain that gave defenders access to nomadic allies whose cavalry could contest Arab military supremacy on tactical terms that Persian infantry formations had been unable to match. The Arab commanders who conducted the Transoxianan campaigns through the late 7th and early 8th centuries of the Common Era found themselves in a war of attrition against a political environment that refused to produce the single, decisive engagement whose outcome would settle everything. They took cities. The cities rose in rebellion. They suppressed the rebellions. New rebellions emerged in cities they had considered pacified. The Sogdian city-states cultivated relationships with the Western Turkic nomads of the steppe and with the Tang dynasty of China, playing the same diplomatic game of leveraging outside powers against immediate threats that had sustained Sogdian independence through a dozen previous cycles of conquest and accommodation. For a time, this strategy appeared capable of working. The Arab advance stalled repeatedly in the face of Sogdian resistance, Turkish intervention, and the sheer logistical difficulty of sustaining military operations across the vast distances of Central Asia. What eventually broke the Sogdian resistance was not a single military defeat, but the cumulative exhaustion of the political alternatives. The Tang connection, which had offered the most credible counterweight to Arab pressure, was severed by the Battle of Talas in 751. The Turkic alliances, always contingent on the nomadic leadership's calculation of their own interests, proved unreliable at critical moments, and the internal unity of the Sogdian city-states, never strong enough to produce a unified military command, fragmented under the sustained pressure of campaigns that each individual city-state lacked the resources to resist alone. The last significant figure of organized Sogdian resistance was Devashtich, the ruler of Panjikent, whose final years are documented with an intimacy that few historical collapses can match, because the documents he left behind survived when he did not. Devashtich was not merely a local strongman making a last, desperate stand. He was a sophisticated political operator who had served as the Tang-appointed governor of Samarkand, attempting to use the Chinese imperial connection as a source of legitimacy and a counterbalance against Arab pressure. His strategy, maintaining the Tang relationship while building coalitions among the Turkic nomadic peoples of the steppe, and attempting to coordinate resistance across multiple Sogdian city-states, was rational in design and ultimately fatal in execution. Not because it was poorly conceived, but because the external supports on which it depended proved unavailable when the decisive moment arrived. The Tang were too distant to provide effective military assistance when Arab forces moved decisively against Panjikent in the early 7th 20s of the Common Era. The Turkic alliances collapsed under Arab military pressure, and the pragmatic recalculations that nomadic leaders make when the balance of power shifts decisively. Devashtich retreated to the mountain fortress on Mount Mu above the Zerevshan Valley, holding out with whatever forces remained loyal, while the world he had governed dissolved around him. The fortress fell around the year 722. Devashtich was captured and executed. What he left behind, preserved by the dry mountain air in one of history's more extraordinary archival accidents, was a collection of documents on leather and wood that gives us the most intimate surviving portrait of a Sogdian community in its final years of independence. Administrative texts, recording the governance of his territory, sit alongside commercial correspondence from merchants who were somehow continuing to conduct business, even as the political situation disintegrated around them. Personal letters preserve glimpses of individual lives, the concerns, the relationships, the daily preoccupations of people whose world was ending without their having chosen or accepted that ending. A tax official worrying about collection shortfalls, a merchant negotiating the terms of a delayed payment, a soldier reporting on the movement of enemy forces with the flat professional tone of someone who has not yet allowed himself to understand what those movements mean. The Mount Mug documents are not heroic. They are human, which is a more powerful thing to be. They preserve. In the original voices of people writing for immediate practical purposes rather than for historical posterity. The texture of a civilization conducting the ordinary business of existence right up until the moment when existence, as they had known it, became impossible. The fall of Panji did not produce the immediate disappearance of Sogdian culture. Languages, artistic traditions, religious practices, and commercial habits do not evaporate when a fortress falls or a ruler is executed. They persist in the daily lives of the people who have always practiced them, changing gradually under new pressures rather than vanishing at a stroke. The Arab conquest imposed new political masters and a new religious framework. But the conversion of the Sogdian population to Islam was a process measured in generations rather than years. Driven by a combination of practical incentive and genuine intellectual engagement rather than simple coercion. The Islamic educational system, mosque-based learning, emphasizing Arabic literacy and the study of the Quran and Islamic jurisprudence, offered opportunities for advancement in the new political order that the older Zoroastrian and Buddhist educational institutions could not match. The Sogdian elite families who chose conversion and acquired the Arabic literacy needed to participate in the administrative and intellectual life of the Abbasid Caliphate were able to maintain and, in some cases, improve their social position within the new order. Those who held to their traditional religious identities faced steadily increasing disadvantage in a world organized around Islamic norms. The gradual arithmetic of these individual decisions, made by thousands of families across several generations, produced the cultural transformation that no single military campaign had been able to achieve. The cultural contribution that the converted Sogdians and their descendants made to Islamic civilization was enormous and deserves more recognition than it typically receives. The Persian language literary tradition that flourished in Transoxiana from the 9th century onward, poetry, geography, history, theology, science was produced largely by the descendants of the Sogdian population. Writing in a language that combined Arabic religious vocabulary with the Iranian literary tradition the Sogdians had always inhabited, the poet Rudaki, the scholar al-Bukhari, the geographical knowledge embedded in the great Islamic geographical texts of the 9th and 10th centuries all drew on the legacy of the Sogdian commercial civilization, even while expressing themselves in entirely new linguistic and religious frameworks. The Sogdians did not simply disappear into Islam. They helped build it, carrying into the new civilization the commercial intelligence, the cosmopolitan openness, and the practical intellectual sophistication that had always been the distinctive marks of their culture. The most direct surviving linguistic descendant of the ancient Sogdian language is Yagnobi, spoken today by approximately 12,000 people in the Yagnob Valley of Tajikistan and in Dushanbe, where many Yagnobi speakers were forcibly relocated during the Soviet period. The Yagnob Valley's geographic isolation, a remote mountain corridor that successive rulers of the region had little practical reason to penetrate, preserved the language through 1,000 years of surrounding linguistic change that replaced Sogdian everywhere else with Persian, Turkic, and eventually the languages of the modern nation-states carved from the Central Asian interior in the 20th century. The Soviet-era forced relocation of Yagnobi speakers to the Vakh cotton-growing region in the 1970s severely disrupted the community and accelerated language loss among younger generations. The partial reversal of this relocation, as returned community members have re-established themselves in the Yagnob Valley, has given the language's survival a new, fragile chance. The documentation and revitalization of Yagnobi is now a priority of Tajik linguistic scholars and international organizations working on endangered language preservation. The people of the Yagnob Valley are the last living community whose daily speech connects them directly to the ancient Sogdian civilization, a thread of linguistic continuity running unbroken across 14 centuries of conquest, conversion, displacement, and change. The legacies the Sogdians left to the world are more varied and more consequential than their current obscurity might suggest. The Sogdian script, adapted by the early Turkic peoples to write their own language, was subsequently adapted again to write Mongolian and then Manchu, creating a genealogical chain of graphic transmission that carries the visual memory of the ancient Sogdian writing tradition into the vertical Mongolian script still used in Inner Mongolia today. The glazing techniques developed in Sogdian ceramic workshops of the pre-Islamic period became the foundation of the turquoise and green glazed pottery traditions that spread across the Islamic world and eventually influenced ceramic traditions from Persia to Spain. The caravanserai system that the Sogdians institutionalized as commercial infrastructure shaped the organization of long-distance trade across the Islamic world for centuries. The paper-making knowledge transmitted through the Talas prisoners remade the intellectual life of the entire subsequent world. The pipa still plays in Chinese concert halls. The pearl roundel pattern still appears in textile designs, whose makers have no idea they are echoing a motif refined in a Zeravshan Valley workshop 15 centuries ago. The modern cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, their magnificent Islamic monuments, rising from the same ground where Sogdian palaces once stood. Their bazaars, continuing a commercial tradition that predates Islam by a millennium, are the most visible heirs of the world the Sogdians built. And the entrepreneurial model, the Sogdians, perfected diaspora networks, reducing transaction costs across vast distances. Commercial credit extended on the basis of community trust rather than formal legal enforcement. Market intelligence shared collectively within the network, while protected from outside competitors, prefigured the commercial innovations of the Venetians, the Hanseatic merchants, and the joint stock companies of early modern Europe by centuries. The Sogdians did not invent capitalism, but they proved at continental scale, and sustained the proof for over 1,000 years, that commerce organized through network trust rather than military coercion could generate prosperity, transmit culture, and connect civilizations more effectively than any empire. The final paradox of their story is one they would have recognized immediately, because it has the precise shape of a commercial miscalculation. They were destroyed not by any failure of their genius, but by its ultimate success. The Silk Road commerce they managed was the mechanism through which the civilizations at both ends of the route grew wealthy enough and confident enough to seek direct connections with each other, bypassing the Central Asian oases that had made those connections possible in the first place. The maritime routes that eventually replaced the overland Silk Road were longer in distance, but shorter in time and cheaper in cost. And they left the Sogdian oases without the commercial role that had been the foundation of everything. The greatest merchants in the ancient world were undone by the market they had spent 1,000 years building. That is not a tragedy in any simple sense. It is something more interesting, the story of a civilization so good at what it did that it eventually made itself unnecessary, leaving behind a world more connected, more literate, and more commercially sophisticated than the one it had found, and a script still being written. In a mountain valley in Tajikistan, by 12,000 people who carry its oldest living echo in their daily speech.